A Williamstown woman has been found guilty of murdering her boyfriend in March of last year. Our Chase Campbell has the details.
After a week-long trial and an afternoon of deliberation, jurors returned with their verdict on charges against Barbara Cupp just before 5:30 p.m. Friday.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Barbara L. Cupp, guilty of murder in the second degree.
A verdict of murder in the second degree means the killing was done without premeditation. Cupp was charged in September for the death of her on-again, off-again boyfriend, Matthew Bills, at his Williamstown home in March of 2025. The verdict came after attorneys delivered their closing arguments Friday morning. Prosecutor Pat Lefebvre opened his argument by walking jurors through the physical evidence piece by piece. He reminded the jury that Bills was shot 3 times, in the stomach, the chest, and the back, and argued that the medical evidence simply didn't add up to Cupp's account of a desperate struggle. Lefebvre zeroed in on a CT scan taken when Cupp arrived at Camden Clark Hospital. The lead trauma surgeon testified that the scan found no injuries beyond the gunshot wound. Lefebvre told the jury that directly contradicted Cupp's testimony that Bills beat her more than 10 times with a firearm.
What else did she tell you at that point when she is being beaten by a 240-pound man with a gun? He's attempting to push it into her mouth, and she wouldn't let it. She was fighting it. Go back to the doctor's testimony. Go back to the CT scan. No injuries to her lips. No injuries at all.
Lefebvre also challenged whether Cupp could have physically fired the shots that killed Bills after she had been shot. Medical testimony established that the bullet severed a major nerve in Cupp's arm, rendering it useless almost immediately.
That shot immediately severed that nerve in her arm, rendering that arm useless. Now, she said she was able to fight him off, get the gun, and then fire 2 rounds. Does that make sense to you, ladies and gentlemen?
And Lefebvre argued that the text messages between Cupp and Bills told their own story, that Bills was trying to end their relationship and that Cupp wouldn't accept it.
He's the one who is trying to get out of this relationship. He's the one who is ending things, and she won't accept it.
Defense attorney George Cosenza came out swinging in his closing, accusing the state of shifting its theory of the case and calling the idea that Cupp planned a murder over a breakup flat out unreasonable.
It absolutely makes no sense whatsoever that Barbie Cupp would murder Matt Bills premeditatedly, deliberately, and maliciously simply because their relationship was ending. There's no evidence whatsoever at all in the record about that.
Cosenza walked through what he called multiple layers of evidence that Bills was the one who fired first. The 911 call, a phone call to her mother, and handwritten notes Cupp wrote while waking up from sedation, saying, "He shot me and Matt shot me," without any prompting from family members. Cosenza said that Cupp's testimony was consistent with evidence and stressed that the prosecution bears the burden of disproving self-defense beyond a reasonable doubt. He told the jury that Cupp was trapped in a bathroom, had already been shot and fired to save her own life.
She ended up retrieving the gun and shot him in self-defense. That is a viable theory based on the evidence in this case. And that theory is the theory of innocence.
Cupp faces 10 to 40 years in prison for the second-degree murder conviction. She was also found guilty of 1 count of person prohibited possessing a firearm. Her sentencing is scheduled for May 28th at 2 p.m. In Parkersburg, Chase Campbell, WTAP News.